Hi, for the next few minutes I want to survey the book of First Thessalonians in the New Testament. This is not a perfect survey, but it does give you an idea of what I do when I survey a biblical book. And so let's launch right into it. The purpose of a survey is to give you the big picture of a book. So it's not to focus on the trees. Most people, in my experience, have a tendency to focus on the minutia of a book. We are memory verse people. We focus on individual verses. But a survey is really like getting in a helicopter and going up, a couple thousand feet and getting a sense of the lay of the land. So you're not wanting to look at the individual trees or what lovely moss we have over here, but you're wanting to get a sense of, the overall picture of a book. So I always start, and of course I'm following the method somewhat of Robert Traina, that I learned at Asbury Seminary, although I've made it my own. So I start with chapter titles. We realize, of course, that the chapters were not part of the original Bible. They were added later for reference convenience. And so the chapter, the divisions, the actual intrinsic divisions of a book like First Thessalonians probably won't follow the chapters. And sometimes there are chapter divisions in the New Testament. You think, why in the world did they divide it here? But the purpose of giving titles, and I also add a sentence for each chapter, is to get to know the material. It's about getting to know the content. It's not about, we're not done when we give titles to the chapters. We're just getting to know the content as we begin our survey. So I titled this time around the first chapter of 1 Thessalonians, "You Turned from Idols." So Paul greets the Thessalonians and he begins to recount their mutual story. By the way, the fact that they turned from idols strongly suggests that the audience of 1 Thessalonians, and thus that the church at Thessalonica, was primarily Gentile. That is, I would hope that there were some Jewish converts at Thessalonica as well, but it appears that the church at Thessalonica was predominantly a Gentile church. Chapter 2, Mission Interrupted. Paul continues in chapter 2 to recount their mutual story, talking about his time at Thessalonica and their persecution. Of course, if we turn to Acts, and of course, we're surveying 1 Thessalonians. We don't want to let, as it were, our knowledge of Acts impinge upon our survey of 1 Thessalonians. We do that when we get to biblical theology. I mean, we could do it a little bit in our interpretation. We want to be very careful to let 1 Thessalonians speak for itself. As it were, when we're doing inductive Bible study, we don't want to infect our interpretation of 1 Thessalonians by bringing in material from Acts until after we've let 1 Thessalonians have its own say, then we begin to dialogue perhaps with Acts. That's at least that's, if you're really wanting to do inductive Bible study, that's the way to go about doing it. So, chapter 3, relieved at the report. So Paul finally sends Timothy back to find out how the Thessalonians are doing. Timothy returns with good news. They have the plane took off. He had to leave before he saw whether the plane got off the runway, but Timothy gets back, and yes, in fact, they are still in the faith. When we get to chapter 4, we get to the actual instruction so the first three chapters of 1 Thessalonians are kind of recounting their mutual story. When we get to chapter 4, we get to the instruction, the center of the instruction. So the dead will rise. Apparently, this is not a subject that Paul had covered very well in the weeks that he was there. He wasn't there for too long. Somewhere in between 3 weeks, 2 months, he was there. The dead in Christ will rise. That gets to the dominant instructional issue in 1 Thessalonians is the second coming and the resurrection. So Paul gets to the heart of the letter in chapter 4, addressing sexual immorality in the first part of it, and also the resurrection. And then chapter 5 continues the second coming resurrection theme, and I called it a thief in the night. That's where one of the places we get that expression from. This is, of course, the place where Paul says, no, that's, never mind. Okay, so Paul finishes up the letter with questions about the timing of Christ's return, and he gives them some final instructions as the letter closes. So, even though the chapter divisions weren't part of the original letter, this has been a nice little, so I would have read through 1 Thessalonians a few times, maybe 3 times, and then given titles to each of the chapters, and I think the sentence is a nice touch myself. Okay, part 1 of a survey, chapter titles. Part 2 of a survey is an outline. From my professor at Asbury, David Bauer, I like to draw my outlines. So here is my drawn outline of 1 Thessalonians. So we have introductory material, and so this is if you were to put it into the boring Roman numerals, this would be Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, Roman numeral 4, and then these would be subheadings: capital A, capital B, capital A, capital B, capital A, capital B, capital A, capital B, kind of the subheadings of the Roman numerals at the top. So the introduction of the first chapter has a greeting and a thanksgiving. To me, that's all kind of introductory stuff. Thanksgiving. This is also standard for ancient letters. Letters began with a kind of hello, and then they usually had some kind of a blessing or praise to the gods. I thank God that your goiter has gone away, that sort of thing. So we have, and in Paul's letters, the Thanksgiving section usually anticipates the content of the letter in some way. Then I mentioned that in chapters 2 and 3, Paul spends a lot of time kind of recounting their mutual story about, so chapter 2, about their time together when he was with them, and then chapter 3, about how he sent Timothy to check up on them, and so forth. Then the main instructions. This is the heart of the letter right here, 4:1 to 5:11. That's the major instructional content. Live sanctified lives, which with special emphasis to sexual morality in those first 8 verses. And then we have, the second coming, which is, this is the real core of the instruction of the letter. And then conclusion, he gives final instructions, miscellaneous instructions, and a farewell. So first, when I survey, I give titles to the chapters and a sentence. Then second, I give an outline. And then the third and fourth part, well, let me say third part. So the third part of my survey is I ask, okay, if this is the outline, if these really are major breaks, if these are major transitions in the outline, then there should be relationships between this and this, between this and this, between this and this. What are the major relationships between the parts of the outline? And ask questions. Now, since this is a survey, we're not equipped yet, maybe, in theory, we're not equipped yet to answer these questions. We may have some hunches, but we're just doing a kind of survey. We're doing an observation. We're not doing detailed study yet. We're just trying to get acquainted and get a sense of what are the questions that 1 Thessalonians wants to ask. Of course, we have all kinds of questions, but those questions we bring from us, the world in front of the text. What questions does the text itself want to answer? What is its agenda? Not what is my agenda for the text. I'm coming with answers, looking for answers to my questions. That's rather self-centered. What about the text's questions? What questions does 1 Thessalonians itself want to answer? And so the third part of my survey is I look for relationships between the parts of the outline, and I raise questions about the parts of the outline. Now, some of these outline relationships and questions are fairly boring to me. So like there's an introduction in my outline, and it introduces the letter. Okay, so I might ask some questions. So usually I ask 4 kinds of questions. Again, I got this from Asbury. I ask questions of definition. I ask questions like how questions, in what way questions. And then I ask why questions. And then usually I ask questions of implications. Now, since I'm trying to survey the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians to begin with, then by implications I don't mean implications for today. I'm looking for implications for the original meaning. In other words, if I answer these other questions, there will be implications for my understanding of the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians. So when I survey, what I mean by implications is implications for the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians. So introduction, conclusion. Let's just get the easy ones out of the way. So there's a conclusion to the letter. So why does Paul give these particular instructions in the conclusion? How does this appropriately bring the letter to a close? What are the implications of the answers to these questions for the original meaning. There could be many more questions than this. For example, I didn't put any questions of definition in there, but there might be specific content in the introduction and conclusion that seems very important, where I might say, well, what does this word mean? What does sanctify mean, for example? I didn't put the recurring of sanctification language in my survey, but it does appear twice, in at least twice in the letter. Maybe I missed it. You can decide. Okay, so introduction, conclusion, preparation. So if the introduction introduces the letter and the conclusion concludes the letter, then what does that kind of retelling of the story do? Well, I'm going to call it preparation. And I have a whole list of this. If you've had a course with me, then I've given a whole list. So there's recurrence, contrast, comparison, cause, effect, substantiation, explanation, purpose, movement from general to particular, movement from particular to general. These are all different kinds of relationships: introduction, conclusion, preparation. But basically, 2:1 through 3:3 give background to Paul's relationship with the Thessalonians. This material prepares for the instruction he gives in the later part of the letter. And it prepares not necessarily in a cognitive way, but it prepares in a affective way. That's part of the letter too. Let us not be so silly as to think that letters were just about truth claims. There were affective and relational dimensions to letters, and that may be more important for what this preparation does here than the actual cognitive content. So why does Paul? I've got a why question. Why does Paul give this much backstory? I've got a how question. How do these chapters prepare for the instructions to come? I've got my implication question. What are the implications of the answer to these questions for the original meaning? I didn't put any definition questions, but again, there may be some key terms in the preparation that you would want to ask about. So that's my third one. Now, real world cause and effect. There are two kinds of cause and effect. There's a cause and effect in argument, this idea, therefore this idea, but there's also real world cause effect, where this event causes this event. So Paul recounts a situation in these chapters in 2:1 through 3:13. That's why I put the word with. I'm associating this with the preparation. There's a situation that has given rise to the writing of First Thessalonians, and this preparatory comments gives us hints at the situation that has led to the writing of this letter. So the situation that Paul recounts in these chapters 2 and 3 apparently gives rise to the writing of 1 Thessalonians itself. So if you could answer questions like, well, how so? How did it give rise? You've really gotten at the heart of understanding the reason for 1 Thessalonians if you can answer this question. Why did this situation lead Paul to write 1 Thessalonians, and implication? So this is a survey. We're flying in the helicopter, but if you wanted to write a commentary on 1 Thessalonians, you would want to dig in. These are the right questions. These are the questions that 1 Thessalonians wants you to ask, because they're the questions that arise out of our observation of 1 Thessalonians. Okay, so we had introduction, we had conclusion, we had preparation. There's also a big therefore in 4:1. It's not always translated. Not every version. I think one version I was looking at had finally. The New International Version has finally. But it's the word therefore. And so I'm going to say that there is a logical cause and effect between the first part or there's some kind, maybe it's not logical, but there's some kind of a letter cause and effect between the first part and the second part of the letter. So how so? What is this logical cause and effect? What is the cause-effect relationship between the materials that preceded and these particular instructions? Why does Paul give these particular instructions specifically? And what are the implications of the answers to these questions for the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians? So what I did is I basically took the outline and I asked, how do these parts relate to each other? Well, the introduction relates to the rest because it introduces it. And the conclusion relates to the rest because it concludes it. And this narrative background gives background. It prepares for the main instructions. And then there's a therefore in 4:1. So you can see what I've done is I've asked what are the relationships between the major relationships between the parts of the outline. And then I've asked questions about them. So, my first part of a survey is to give chapter titles. The second part of a survey is to give an outline. And the third part is to ask questions, to identify major relationships between the parts of the outline and to raise major questions. So the final part, in the way I do a survey, is I look for recurring threads. That is, so if the third part looked at relationships between the outline, the fourth part looks for threads that recur throughout the entire letter, and of course I'm going to ask questions about them. So it seems to me that there's a recurrence of expectation of Christ's return that goes across throughout 1 Thessalonians. It's not just limited to that third section. I can find examples in chapter 1 and in chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 and in chapter 5. And so it seems to me that this expectation of Christ's second coming is a major player in 1 Thessalonians. So what are the different instances where this recurrence takes place? I've listed several, but what are the instances? What clarifications does Paul make about the second coming? In other words, what's the big deal? How exactly does he formulate that expectation of Christ's second coming? You might ask, what's the relation? I didn't put this here. What's the relationship between the second coming and the resurrection? These are, I haven't done a good job, I don't think, in this survey of asking questions. You could have many more questions than I've asked. You pretend like you're from Mars and you've learned English or you've learned Greek and you're reading 1 Thessalonians, but you don't know anything about this Christianity. What questions would you ask? If you really want to be objective, or as objective as possible, about 1 Thessalonians, then you need to empty your mind of all your foregone conclusions and try to listen to it and ask the kinds of questions someone in kindergarten might ask. So why does 1 Thessalonians put such an emphasis on that expectation? And what are the implications for the answers to these questions for the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians? So I'm asking, that's one recurrence that I thought was worth mentioning. Here's another one. There is a recurring concern Paul has for the well-being of the Thessalonians. So where in 1 Thessalonians do we find this concern? I mentioned a couple places. What are the other elements of Paul's concern? So is it just spiritual well-being? When I first put this down, I put for the spiritual well-being. But it seems like he's concerned about more than just their spiritual well-being. He says in 5:23, your whole body, soul, and spirit. And it's a corporate thing. It's not just individual. So what dimensions of their well-being are of interest to Paul? In what ways does Paul express this concern throughout the letter? Why is Paul so concerned that they be found blameless? And what are the implications to the answers to these questions for the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians? Here's another one. Recurring devotion and ultimate regard for God and Christ. Seems to me that this is going to show up in most letters that you would survey. So where in the letter does Paul express that sort of devotion? What are some of the ways in which Christ's devotion and devotion to God the Father are expressed in 1 Thessalonians? Is there any distinction between those devotions in 1 Thessalonians? Why does Paul express the sense of devotion and ultimacy to God and Christ? And what are the implications for the answers to this question to the original meaning of 1 Thessalonians? Now maybe I've missed something, but that is my go at a survey. I got in a helicopter. I flew over 1 Thessalonians territory a few times. I gave chapter titles to get me into the content. I did an outline to try to see how that content's arranged. I looked for relationships between the parts of the outline and asked questions. And then I looked for threads that ran throughout and asked questions. And that is my survey of 1 Thessalonians.